If you have an Adobe subscription, you might as well cancel it because in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a Photoshop clone using CSS and React. And if you enjoyed this tutorial and want to learn everything there is to learn about React, make sure to check out my full course. I'll link down in the description below. Let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now on the right hand of my screen, I have that Photoshop clone open, and while no, it doesn't have all the features of Photoshop, it actually does some pretty good photo editing for you. As you can see, we can adjust the brightness, contrast, saturation, grayscale, sepia, hue rotation, and blur of this photo. And we do all that with this single slider down here. So let's bump up the brightness a little bit. Maybe we turn down the contrast a little bit. We could bump up the saturation. We could make this a grayscale image if we wanted to. Same with those sepia tones. We could rotate the hue, which really does crazy things with our image. And then lastly, if we want to, we can add a little bit of blur to our image to make it, blurrier. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do with this program. And I'm going to show you exactly how to create that with React. On the left-hand side, all I've done so far is essentially run create React app, and I just deleted out the files we don't need, so we're left with an empty CSS file, essentially an empty app.js, and this index is essentially exactly the same as before. So now we can get started with writing out the HTML structure for this application over here. Now the very first thing I want to do is come in here, and I just want to wrap everything inside of a div with the class of container. And this container class is essentially going to be a CSS grid layout, which allows us to put our image in the top left, this sidebar on the right hand side, and then this slider on the very bottom. And we're going to lay all of that out using CSS grid. Now, the first thing we're going to need is our image. And instead of using a normal image tag here, what we're going to use is just a background image. So we're going to use a div, and we're going to make sure we give it a class here of main image, so we can later apply the background image in CSS. And we can just leave this as an empty div because we're not going to put anything inside of it since that background image is going to be the image we see on our screen. And the next thing that we're going to have is going to be this sidebar section. So let's just create a div. We're going to give it a class name here, which is equal to sidebar. And inside of this sidebar, we're going to put all of these different text items. And for now, we're just going to leave this blank because we're going to fill in that text later with custom sidebar item components. And the last thing that we're going to need is going to be our slider, which again is going to be a custom component. I'll just create that custom component now. So we'll say slider, and we'll just leave this completely blank. And we'll create a new component called slider.js. And if you type RFC and hit enter, that'll give you this component. And that is because I have an extension installed here called ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. Really useful for just, making quick boilerplate components like this. So I highly recommend you download that. And in here, let's just put the text slider for now so we can see this working. Save everything. And now if we run npm start, give it a couple seconds, it should open up on the right-hand side of our screen, our application. Let it load for a little bit. And here we go. Of course, now it's saying slider is not defined. So we need to make sure we import that in our React, our app component here. So import slider from /slider. And now we should see everything's working. We have the text slider, and there's nothing else on our page right now, so that's all that we're seeing. If we just put some text in here that says sidebar, we can actually see our sidebar. And if we don't make this an empty div, we can say image, close that off, and now we can see our text image. So we have our three main components. Now, the very first thing we can work on is actually putting our slider into our page so that we have this slider here. It's actually fairly straightforward to do. We're going to have this div here be like a wrapper around it. So we'll give it a class name here of slider container, just so we know that this is the container that contains our slider. And then instead of putting our text here, we're going to have an input with a type of range. So we can say range. We're also going to give this a class name of slider so that we can style this as we need. And let's just close that off. We're not going to give it any values or anything for now. That'll be handled later. So now if we save, you should see that we have some kind of slider input that we can manipulate. Now with that done, we can work on styling this with our app.css file, which is imported here for us. So we can come in here. The very first thing I like to do is just set up my box sizing. So we'll say our before and our after elements. Whoops. This essentially just selects everything for us. And we'll just say box sizing is going to be border box. That makes sizing our widths and heights much easier. And we also want to remove any margin from our body. And if we save, you can see everything gets pushed up to the edges because we no longer have that margin. Now the first thing that I want to style is that container that we wrapped everything inside of, because this is going to set up our grid container for our application. So of course, we're going to make this a display of grid, and then we're going to work on our grid template columns. We want to have our grid, our grid template rows. And then we're going to do the exact same thing here with our template areas, just to define exactly how everything is laid out. And if we look over here, what we want to do is we want our image to take up as much space as humanly possible, and everything else is going to be squished into the sides. So we know that our very top left portion of our grid, because this is a 2x2 grid, this is going to be 1FR. Essentially, it's going to expand as much as possible. And then we want our sidebar, this right-hand column, to be as narrow as possible, so we'll give it the width of auto. Same thing for our rows, we want 1FR and auto because we want this bottom portion to be as small as possible and the image to fill up as much of the top row as it can. Now for our grid template areas, I generally like to do this on a separate line. And we know that our top left item is going to be our image. Then our sidebar is going to be in this right-hand column. Then if we go down to our next row, we have our slider, which is in this bottom left, and our sidebar here is going to also be in the bottom left because it's going to span the entire height of our page, unlike the image which only spans this first row and this first column. So that's all of our areas, rows, and columns set up for this container. Now all that's left to do is make sure this container fills the full page. So we'll set the height to 100 view height. We're going to set the width to 100 view width. And lastly, I'm just going to set a background color here, which is just going to be a really kind of light gray. As you can see here, we have white, and here we have that nice gray offset. That's just going to be a bunch of DAs like that. If I save and come over here, you can see we get that gray color. And as you can see already, we have our image in the top left, our sidebar over here is on the right, and our slider is in the bottom. So for the most part, this is working how we want it to. Now to make sure all of these elements are taking up the space we want, let's just select them real quick. So we can say main image, make sure that's a class selector, and we'll give it the grid area of image so that it corresponds with this grid area here. And we'll just say background color is going to be red for now. If we save, we should see that takes up this top left column, which is exactly what we want. Then we can do our sidebar, which if you remember, we gave our sidebar that sidebar class. We can give it a grid area, and this is going to be sidebar. We're going to give it a background color of purple just to see what this looks like. And you'll see that this takes up this entire height here, exactly like we want it to. And lastly, we have our slider. And if you remember, we wrapped our slider in this slider container. So we're going to use the slider container and give it that grid area for our slider. And also let's just put the background color to green just so we can see it. And you can see that bottom portion is now green. Now in order to make our slider fill up a little bit more of the space and not just be stuck in this bottom left-hand corner, let's come and make our slider container have a little bit of extra spacing. We'll say we want the margin on the top to be 2 rem, and padding all around this is going to be 2 rem as well. That's just going to give us a bunch of space around our slider as well as some margin between our image and our slider. Lastly, we can select our slider itself, and we can set the width to 100%, and we can set the cursor to pointer. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it fill the full width, and then when we hover over it, it's going to give us this nice pointer cursor to know we can interact with it. And let's just remove that green color, and now we essentially have this slider complete and won't need to make any more changes to these styles. The next thing I want to work on is this red image section. So let's go to our main image, which is right here. And all we need to do in this main image is first change our background color here to be a background image. We want to get a URL. And this URL, I'm just copying from Unsplash. You can use any image you want, but this is just that tree picture that we see here. I think it works pretty well for this example, so I've copied it over. But again, feel free to use any image you want. I again want to set the width and the height to be 100% just to make sure it fills that full space. And if we save this, you should see that nothing is actually showing up right now. And that's because this image is really, really large. As you can see now, it just loaded in. It is a huge image, and it's going to only show the part of the image that is visible inside this div. So what we want to do is make sure this image is shrunk down. We can do that by saying background position is going to be top and center, and that the background size is going to be contain. Now if we save, you can see that it fits the entire image inside of our screen, and it's going to position in the top and the center of our page. But you notice on the left and right, it's repeating our image. We don't actually want this repeat. So we can say background repeat is going to be no repeat, And all that's going to do is remove the repeat and just leave empty space essentially on the left and right if there's no room for the entire image. And that is everything we need to do for putting our image on the page. And if we go back here, we can just remove this image text and make sure this is an empty div, and that'll get rid of that image text in the top left corner. And that's everything for our image section done. Now, before we go about styling this sidebar, we need to actually put content inside of it. And to do that, we're going to use a sidebar item component, which we're going to create. So let's just come in here and create a new file called sidebar item.js. And we can do that RFC trick again to get that sidebar item. And then if we go inside of our app here, we just put in, for example, 2 sidebar items. And we're going to import sidebar item from /sidebar item. And now inside of our sidebar item, let's actually put in our code. And all we want here is a single button. And this button is going to contain all of the logic for when we click on it to be able to switch between contrast, brightness, and so on. So all we need is the button, and that button is just going to have some text in it. For now, we're just going to put sidebar item in here as a placeholder. And of course, we're going to need a class name to style this. So we're just going to give it a class name of sidebar item, just like that. And if I come over here, save app, you should see that we have our 2 sidebar items side by side, which is good enough for our purposes now. Also, we're going to want to deal with an active class. So when we hover over an item and it's selected like this, you can see grayscale is selected, contrast is selected. We want to be able to determine which one is the active one. We're going to use an active class for that. For now, we'll just leave them both inactive and start styling this out. So jump back into our app CSS. And the first thing I want to work on styling is the actual sidebar. Our background color is no longer going to be purple. We're going to use a nice HSL, which has a purple color, and we'll use the hue of 265, 100% on the lightness, and we're going to use 80% or 86%, I'm sorry, as the lightness. So we have 100% saturation, 86% lightness, and we save. We get that nice light purple color. Next thing I want to do is add a little bit of a border on the left-hand side, which is going to use the exact same hue and saturation. We're just going to make it quite a bit darker at 56%. And that just, when we save that, is going to give us a little bit of separation between our background color here and our image. And if we make sure we give that a size of 1 pixel solid, you should see that nice dark purple color showing up to really distinguish our sidebar from the rest of the content on our page. Now, the last thing I want to do is determine how the images inside the sidebar are laid out. And we're going to use Flexbox for that. We're going to make sure that we have a flex direction here, which is going to be column. And then all we want to do is align our items to be stretch. And what that's going to do is make sure our items stretch out to the full width. So if we had different text in each item, they would all be the same full width, which is exactly what we want. Now we can move on to actually styling each one of our sidebar items themselves. And of course, the first thing we want to do is change our cursor to pointer, so we know that we can click on each one of these items. We want to get rid of all of these normal button styles. So we'll say border, it's going to be none. Outline is going to be none. And immediately that gets rid of a lot of the colors. But of course, we need to change our background. So we'll say background color here. It's going to be that same HSL, 265, 100%, and 86% here. And now if we save that, you can see that that background color essentially just blends in. We essentially have no background color right now, which is exactly what we want. Now with that done, we can give them a little bit of space. We'll say padding is going to be 1 rem, and we're just going to use position relative here because we're actually going to make these underlines here be pseudo elements, which need to be absolutely positioned, which is why we have that position relative on our sidebar item. We save, we now get that spacing exactly like we want. Now let's select our sidebar item, and we want to worry about our hover state as well as our sidebar item focus state. And this is just to make it easy to tell which item we're hovering over, because right now there's really no indication. All we're going to do is take our background color and we're just going to make it slightly darker like this. And if we save and hover, you now see that we're instantly changing that background color. But I want to make this a little bit of a smoother transition. As you can see over here, we have that nice smooth animation. So in order to do that, it's actually fairly straightforward. All we need to do is on our sidebar item, set a transition for our background color. And let's just say it's going to be 150 milliseconds. Now when we save, it'll take about 150 milliseconds for the color to change, which gives us that nice, really quick fade effect. Now, as you remember me saying, there's going to be an active version of our sidebar item. So we're going to have our sidebar item.active. And this is just going to be essentially the same thing, but an even darker background color. We're going to use 46% here. And if we were to go and take our sidebar item and make it active, you can now see it has that really dark color, which is exactly what we want. And that color actually seems to be a little bit too dark. So let's go back into here and we're going to change this instead to be maybe 70%. There we go. That looks a lot better at that 70% as opposed to the 46%. Now moving on, the last thing we have left to do is to put in those lines. So let's come in here and get rid of the active class because no longer are these active. And now what we want to do is put these divider lines between each one of our different components. So back into our app CSS, we want to select our sidebar item. And for this, we're going to use the after selector to get that pseudo element, give it some blank content so it'll show up. And we're going to position it absolutely inside of our sidebar item, which has that relative position. Now what we want to do is we want to make the width of this be 80%, so it doesn't quite fill the full line, just partially, which I think looks a little better. We're going to give it a left of 10%. This is going to make it so our line is centered because 10% is going to be moved from the left, and then there's 10% of space left on the right, which means it's going to be exactly centered. Lastly, we'll put the bottom to 0, so it shows up at the very bottom of our element, and we're going to set the height to 1 pixel, just so it's 1 pixel tall. And the very last thing to do is give it a background color so we can see it. Let's use this same HSL value. And here we're going to use that 46%. If we go over here, you now see we have our lines between our elements. And if we want to go a step further, we can actually just take our sidebar item and we want to get the last child after element. And we're just going to say that this is going to be a display of none. We just don't want that divider to show up on the last one because it doesn't make sense because it's not actually dividing from anything. So now we have our sidebars essentially complete. All of the styling for our application is done. Now the next step is going to be the fun part where we actually add in all of our different controls and the ability to control them. So what we want to do is just create a variable we're going to call default options. We're going to set that to an array. And inside of here, we're going to put a bunch of different objects. And these objects are going to define each one of these buttons. So the first thing we're going to have is our name. In our case, this is brightness. And this brightness is going to have a property. And this is what it corresponds to in CSS, which in our case is brightness. Because the way that we're going to change our image is by using a CSS filter. And the CSS filter has a bunch of different properties. Namely, in our case, brightness is one way you can change it. We have contrast, saturation, grayscale, sepia, hue, rotate, and blur. Those are just the ones we're going to deal with. And all of those go on the filter property in CSS. And this is just the name of the property we're changing for that filter. So this is just the CSS property we're changing. Value, this is going to be our default value, which in our case is going to be 100. And then a range is essentially the minimum and maximum of our slider. So value is where our slider starts, and range is going to have a min, or where our slider bottoms out, in our case 0, and a max, in our case 200, where it's going to max out. So 200% brightness, 0% brightness, or 100% brightness. These are our values for this. And then lastly, we're going to need a unit. In our case, our unit is percent. And this again is for CSS because brightness is measured in percentages. So our value of 100 needs to be converted to 100%. And this is going to be for each one of our options. We're going to do this. So let's copy this down. We're going to have contrast. And again, contrast. And it's going to have the same value 100, 0, and 200. Now let's do the same thing for saturation. And saturation is going to be very similar. Just change the text. And it's going to be 100, 0, 200, just like that. Now we're going to move on here to grayscale. And make sure that when you spell this, you spell it with an A so that it works inside of CSS. The E version does not actually work. And by default, we don't want any grayscale in our image. So our minimum is going to be 0, and our maximum is going to be 100% grayscale. And again, this is going to be a percentage. Let's do this again, but we're going to do sepia. And down here, it's going to be sepia. And again, 0 to 100. That makes sense. Now our last two properties here, we have hue rotate. So let's take this, change it to hue rotate. And in CSS, that is hue dash rotate. And we're going to have a starting value of 0. The minimum is 0, but the max is 360 because there's 360 degrees of hue. And again, the unit here is going to be degrees instead of percent. Now, lastly, we're going to have our blur. So we can say blur, blur, just like that. And we're going to go 20 as our maximum blur because blur is quite effective even at a low value like that. And this is going to be in pixels. And that right there is the very last of our options. Let me just scroll up here to the very top real quick, and we're just going to collapse this so it doesn't take up a bunch of space in our application. And the next thing for us to do is to take these default options and turn them into an options object we can use in React and actually modify. So to do that, we're going to need some form of state. So let's import use state from React here. If we come down and just say const, and we want to have our options and set options, we're going to set that equal to use state, and we're going to pass in that default options as our initial state. So initially our options are going to be set to this big array that we have here. But we want to be able to update our value and such, which is why we set this to a state object here, so we can update the value and then re-render everything in React. And if you're not super familiar with this use state concept, I have an entire video covering the use state hook. I'll link down in the cards and description. Now what we can do, instead of here hard coding our sidebar items, let's actually loop through all of our different options and create a sidebar item for them. So for each one of our options, what we want to do is we want to create a sidebar item. I'm just going to close this off on a new line because we're going to have quite a few properties here. The first one is our key. And for this, we're actually not going to have a value on option. We're going to use index instead. So here, let's just take our option, and we're also going to add index in our map. So we essentially have the index of our array as our key. And here, our name is going to be equal to option.name. So now we have the name for our sidebar item, as well as the key for handling things in React. Let's save that, go over to our sidebar item here, and we're going to take that name from the props, and we're just going to print that out here. So we can say name, just like that. And of course, we're getting an error down here. So let's just scroll up, and it's saying expected an assignment or function call, and instead saw an expression. And this is on line 87 in our app.js. The reason for this is that we didn't actually return this sidebar item here. So let's just make sure we return that. We're going to wrap this inside of parentheses and close that off like that. Now if we save, you should see everything works. We come over here, we now have brightness, contrast, saturation, grayscale, sepia, hue rotate, and blur, which of course I spelled blue, so let's just correct that real quick. There we go. Now everything is spelled correctly and looking like we want it to. The next thing to do is to allow us to select one of these items, because right now, obviously we can't select anything. So let's create another state. We'll do selected option index. And we're going to have set selected option index. And of course, we're going to use state for that. So we'll say use state. And by default, we just want to select the first object in our array. So we'll use the index of 0. Now we can actually get our selected option here, which is equal to our options. We want to get the item at the selected option index. So this is our currently selected option right here. And now that we know which option we've selected with the selected option index, we can actually pass that down to our sidebar. We can do that by saying our active property is going to be equal to true if our index is equal to our selected option index. So essentially, if this is the currently selected option, we're going to pass down true for active inside of sidebar item. Now here, let's get that active value. And what we can do is just say that we want to change our sidebar so that it's going to have that active class. So a really easy way to do that is to just use template strings. So we're going to have our template string with sidebar item, and then we're going to run some code in here that says if active is true, then we want to return active. Otherwise, we just return an empty string. So it's going to give us an active class if active is true. And if we save, you can see brightness is selected because it's our very first object in the array, which is the one we defaulted to as active. Now the next thing to work on is actually styling which one is going to be active by letting us click on it and changing that active property. So we need to have some form of on-change event, essentially on-click event that we pass to our button. So let's come in here with a handle click prop. And all we want to do is I'm just going to move these things onto a different line so they're easier to work with. Just like this. There we go. And we want to set up an on-click. And all this on-click is going to do is call the handle click function we pass into our sidebar item. So now inside of our sidebar, we can pass in handle click. We can pass it as a function. And this function, all it's going to do is call the set selected option index, and we're going to pass in the current index of the item that we're on. So now whenever we click on this item, it's going to set it as our selected item. Let's test this. We click saturation. It is now active. Click here, it's active. Up here, it's active, and so on. So now we have perfectly changed our active value. Now the next thing to work on is to make our slider actually correspond with our active value. We can actually pass down a bunch of different props to our slider. We're going to need to pass down our min, which is just our selected option .range.min. We're then going to have a max, which is almost exactly the same. We have selected option .range.max. Let's get the current value here, which is going to be selected option .value. And then lastly, we're going to pass in a handle change event. We're just going to say handle slider change, which is a function that we are going to create now, which will handle this change for us. Let's come up here and create that function. Whoops. There we go. This is going to take in an event, which is going to be where we get our value from. And actually, all we really need from our event is the target. So we're just going to extract out target here, just like that. And now what we can do is we can call set options. And we need to make sure we use our previous options as a param here to this function. And now we just want to return our previous options .map, and we're just going to loop through all of our options till we find the one we want to change, and then we're going to change it and actually update it. So here we're going to have an option and an index, and then this is going to be a function. And if, for example, our index is not equal to our selected index, we know that this option is not the one we have selected, so let's just return it as is. We don't want to change it. Otherwise, if it is the one that we've currently selected, we want to return a new object for our option, which is going to contain everything from our old option, and all we want to do is set the value to the value from our slider, which is from this target object here. So now if we save this, essentially we have our function created and we're passing all of these values down to our slider. So in our slider, let's actually use these different values. We have min, max, value, and handle change. And we just need to pass these to our input as different props. So we can just come down here, hit this all on a new line just to make it easier to work with. And we're going to have our min equal to our min, our max is equal to the max, our value is equal to value, and lastly our on change is equal to handle change. So now when we change these different values, it's actually updating the value of our brightness, contrast, saturation, and so on. And you can see that if I put our brightness all the way down and then click contrast, you can see this is our value for contrast. If I go back to brightness, you can see it's saved that value for us. So now all that's left to do is take all these values and actually add them into our image and do the filtering for us. Luckily for us, this is actually quite easy. In our app.js, let's create a function for this. We'll say function get image style. And this is essentially going to be the style we apply to our image. So here with our image, we can say, whoops, style is going to be equal to get image style, just like that. Now inside of here, let's get our filters. And this is going to be us looping through all of our options to get them converted to a CSS property. So we're going to say options.map over each one of our options. And we essentially want to return a string here. And this is going to use string interpolation. So the first thing is our option.property, because we already know what the property name in CSS is. That's where we got this from. Then we want to give it a parentheses here, because this is actually a function. And inside the parentheses, we pass the value. We can just say option.value. And if you remember correctly, we have a unit for each one of these. So we want to append that unit to the end of our value. So we can just come in here and say option.unit. Make sure that this is a $sign here. And now that is essentially everything for creating the string of our different filters, but this is in an array, and we want this to actually be converted to a style object. So we can return here an object that has a filter key, because we're using that filter property in CSS, and we want to convert this array of filters into a string. We're going to just say join, and we're going to put a space between each one of our different array strings. So now if we save this, you should see our brightness is able to be controlled with this slider. But of course, it's not actually working. So let's inspect here to see what's wrong. Go to our console. There's no errors here, so there must be something wrong with our code. More than likely, what's happened is we've probably spelled one of our properties wrong. So let's look here. We have brightness, that's spelled correctly. Contrast is correct. Saturation looks correct. Grayscale looks correct. Sepia looks correct. Hue rotate looks correct. And blur looks correct. So since all of that looks correct, the next thing we can do is actually inspect our image. And we can just check the styles on it to see if it has the styles we expect. As you can see, I don't see any filter style here for our main image because that's the one we have selected. So something is happening that is not actually getting applied for us. So let's just scroll down here a little bit and look a little bit further to see exactly what's going on. At first glance, I'm obviously not seeing anything. So what we can do is just console.log out our get image style to see what this actually looks like. And when we inspect, we should be able to see in our console these objects, and this is our filter, and we have brightness 100%, that looks correct. Contrast 100% looks correct. Saturation 100% looks correct. We have grayscale, which is 0%, that looks correct. Sepia 0% looks correct. Hue rotate 0 degrees, that looks correct. And blur 0 pixels, all of that looks to be correct. Now the next step to figure out what is wrong is just to slowly remove some of our different properties here. So let's just comment out everything except for brightness. So if we do that, hopefully this is going to work. So now if we change our brightness, you can see the brightness of our image is changing. So we know that brightness is correct. Let's bring in our next one, which is contrast. And if we change, you can see everything is still working as before. So we know that that's fine. Let's bring in our saturation. And now if we changed saturation, that it looks like there's a problem. This is not actually updating anything. We change our contrast, it's not updating anything. And same with our brightness. So something with our saturation property is incorrect. And if we can test this by just commenting this back out and seeing that everything works as before. So there's something wrong with saturation. And it looks like the reason this is wrong is because in CSS, this actually is saturate instead of saturation. So now everything should work as before. As you can see, this is now working. So let's comment in the rest of these and they all should work as well. Save, and you can see we can change our brightness, we can change our contrast, we can change our saturation, make an image grayscale if we want, we can make it have sepia tones, and we can also rotate the image's hue, and lastly, blur it if we really want to. And that's all there is to creating this photo effect inside of React. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my full React course, which I'm going to link down in the description below, and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.